Coach Schexnayder, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy day to kind of hop on here and talk shop a little bit. Most people know who you are, but for the listeners at home who happen to not, will you tell us a little bit about your background, kind of your motivation, and where you are currently?
Well, right now, I run a private consulting business called Schexnayder Athletic Consulting, and I also am the strength coach for the LSU track and field program. In the past, I coached high school for about 11 years before I got started. I ventured into elite level track and field, collegiate level and international level. Did a lot of work with NFL combine stuff, and then eventually moved into a consulting role where I was working with several sports, mostly on speed power development and such. So I've kind of done a little bit of everything, I guess you'd say.
That's awesome. Okay. Would you have any advice kind of on that to young coaches who are kind of trying to find their niche, or what kind of like private sector, consulting, like college, like where they should end up? Do you have any advice on that?
Well, I always felt, and maybe because this is how my career went, but I always felt that the best thing you can do is to throw yourself into your work. Let your passions drive you, let your passions drive your interests, and let your interests drive your career. And once people see that you're passionate, and once people see that you're producing results, well, then opportunities tend to open for you. I think sometimes that you feel like we need a career roadmap of this sequence of jobs or positions, and I don't think it really works that way. I think that if you're putting a lot of energy into worrying about what your next job is going to be, you're probably not doing that great a job on the one you're at. So I just think you invest in your own personal situation at that time, and if you do good work, people always notice.
I love that. Okay. So let's kind of dive right into some training stuff, right? So you work a lot with speed power athletes and drills and exercises and stuff like that, right? So how do you kind of structure your plyometric drills, and what is your kind of recommendation on implementing plyos across different age groups?
Well, I think everybody can do plyometric training. When we think of plyos, we normally think of like really high-level stuff like depth jumps. But, I mean, jump rope is a plyometric. When little kids are out playing hopscotch, that's a plyometric. So I believe in some form of plyo or jump training for kids of every age. And I just think that over the course of time, over the course of a year, and over the course of a career, what we're basically trying to do is achieve higher intensities. So what I kind of do is I always look at it in a couple of phases, I guess. The first phase is kind of a preparatory phase, and in your preparatory phase you have basically 3 boxes to check. You have to establish your training volumes, and we normally do that with in-place jumps. In-place jumps are the best way to establish your training volumes, because when you have an in-place jump circuit, you have so many different exercises in it, and so many different stressors that and they're very diverse, and as a result of that, you don't get the overuse syndromes that you get from other forms of multi-jumps. And then the other side of it is skill development. Nobody thinks of plyometrics as a skill development tool, but that's actually where they're possibly most valuable. So I think you need solid dosages of horizontally based plyometrics and vertically based plyometrics in order to teach, I guess, better the body's ability to apply forces to the ground in different planes. It has a lot to do with the way we accelerate our effectiveness at maximum velocity. So I think those are the 3 key boxes that you check with developmental people in preparation. The volume establishment, the vertical skill, horizontal skill. And then after that, it's about advancing intensities. Whether you move into extended bounds or whether you move into depth jumps or whatever the case may be, depending upon your particular sports requirements. And I just look at that both long-term and short-term as the progression that I typically follow. And I categorize plyometrics into about maybe 7 or 8 different categories, and they're all pretty much based on purpose, I guess you would say.
Okay. Would you mind kind of diving into some of those categories, or what that looks like?
Yeah, sure. Well, I've already mentioned a few, like the short horizontal bounce for horizontal skill development, short vertical for vertical skill development, in-place jumps for volume establishment. I use depth jumps for high-end elastic strength development. When I'm looking to train power sustenance, typically what I use is extended bounding. They work great for sports that have a power component, but also have a significant endurance component as well. And then things like hurdle hops are yet another category. hurdle hops are unique because they're very explosive, very responsive, but at the same time, there's a governor effect in place, meaning that athletes actually control their own intensities when they're doing hurdle hops, as opposed to dip jumps. You know, if I put a kid on a 36-inch box, well, there's no escaping that. But in a hurdle hop, you can kind of govern your own, within some reason, you can govern your own intensities. So that's why when overtraining is kind of looming, or when I'm a little bit suspicious of what fitness state my athletes are in, or what state of overtraining they might potentially be entering, that's often the plyometric choice that I'll use.
Okay, I like that. And then you touched a little bit on, establishing the base of volume and how we need to increase intensity at higher levels, right? But what is like a guideline that you use for volume? So say someone gets a team, right, of, say we're in the college realm or even in the private sector, right, and you get a college age athlete or a high school age athlete, what can you kind of do to start like a base level volume program, or how does that look? Do you use the kind of those same guidelines that you had mentioned earlier?
I first of all, whenever I'm trying to evaluate whether I'm doing too much or not, I always look at the technical side. So whenever I see technique falling off in the course of a plyometric session, well, then I know that I've exceeded my volumes. I've exceeded the working volumes for that type. But the whole volume question is a really complicated one, because volumes for different types of plyometrics can be wildly different. I do simple in-place jump sessions that might have 400, 500 contacts in really low intensity stuff. But if I'm doing a depth jump circuit, then it might be as little as 15 or 20 total contacts. What I did real early in my career was I was really interested in plyometric planning, and what I did was I kept records of all of the volumes of all of the different plyometrics I did, and what I did was I assigned an intensity factor to each one. So if, for example, the intensity factor was 2, well, then I multiplied the number of contacts by 2. If the intensity factor was 3, I multiplied it by 3. And with the idea that if I'm genuinely crossing the volume and intensity curves, that index that I produce should be fairly level throughout the whole year. Well, what I found was I was really hot at certain times and really cold at certain times, and a lot of times the hots matched up with the injury times. So what I did was I eventually came up with guidelines for boundaries for each type of plyometric. So, for example, when I work with short horizontal bounds, I always stay between about 60 and 100 contacts in those types of sessions. When I'm working with in-place jumps, I'm typically working anywhere in the normal stuff I do, typically between 250 and 400 contacts in an in-place jump session. And I don't really keep track of my total volumes anymore. What I do now is I kind of set those boundaries for myself, and I try to live within those boundaries.
I like that. Okay. Do you have any recommendations for different individuals in different settings who may be trying to set their own intensity factors or their own volume parameters for the populations that they are working with?
Yeah, I would do exactly what I did. But that's what's interesting about plyometrics, and what makes plyometrics so difficult is that a lot of it is subjective. Back when I did it, we didn't have the luxury of force platforms and things like that to really measure impact levels. So you had to be kind of subjective. And what I was doing is I was looking at contact times and such, and in horizontal and vertical stuff, and then trying to just kind of come up with I guess you would say, educated guesses as far as the intensity factors are concerned. I think I would do the same thing now. The only difference is that, I don't feel like I need to go back and redo that work, because things have worked out pretty well. But if I was a young coach just getting started now, I think I would use the technology there in order to get a better idea of exactly what forces are being exerted, and you can be a little more accurate when you actually judge intensities of those different types of exercise.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's kind of transition a little bit into some more sprint training. And what kind of is your structure and your recommendations for implementing sprints across different age groups?
Well, everybody sprints. People feel that sprinting is something that's really fancy and needs to be taught at a high level. I prefer to look at sprinting as something that everybody just does naturally. And, so typically what we're trying to do, I guess philosophically, is I look at building the body in a way that enables it to do what it should be able to do naturally. I don't look at sprinting or acceleration as kind of a foreign something that they have to learn. It's a natural movement pattern. I ask people all the time, who taught you to run? And normally they give me the name of some sixth grade track coach or something. But the answer is that one day you just did it.
Yeah.
And I don't want to make it much more complicated than that. So I try to keep my teaching of acceleration and sprinting as simple as I possibly can. And interestingly, the key points for youngsters are not that different than the key points for elite level performers. Some people find that hard to believe, but ultimately, as these athletes get older and older and older, their bodies feel different to them, and therefore, every year you're coaching the same person with the same birth certificate and driver's license, but they're not really the same person. Things feel different to them. So the things like the distributions and such change in some ways, but at the same time, ultimately the basic skills that you're trying to teach haven't really changed much as you progress through those ages. The horsepower increases, the increases in intensity as produced by the athletes produces some different coaching problems, but what you're trying to achieve isn't any different.
I like that. That's a very good approach, and I like the outlook on that, right? Because again, if you're working on the same skills and parameters, like why does the structure have to change that drastically? So I really like that.
Yeah, it's a common mistake, to think that, sometimes I'll talk to coaches and they know I work with really high-level athletes, and, and they think that what I say is, I'll just tell them how I do it and what I do it, and they think it won't work for their people but my kids aren't any smarter and they don't catch on to anything any faster than anybody else.
Yeah.
They're just lucky to be older and lucky to have possibly more talent than the ones you're working with. So they have the same kind of problems that everybody else has from the standpoint of skill acquisition and such. So it's not as different as people think.
Yeah. Okay. No, that makes sense. And then what kind of do you have in terms of like, do you have any yardage volume recommendations or how do you kind of keep track of intensity zones and things like that within the sprinting?
Well, the sprinting, as far as true sprinting, is always, high intensity. But I do have volume boundaries. When I'm working strictly in acceleration zones, which is something I do a lot, I typically try to stay within 200 and 400 total meters in the session. Most of the time I'm hovering around that 300-meter range. When I'm looking at maximal velocity types of work, I typically cap out around 500, maybe 550 meters or so of work.
Okay. That's awesome. Okay. And then what do you think a lot of coaches are doing wrong in the area of like plyometrics and sprint training? Like what are some suggestions that you have for the general coaching public?
Well, I think the first one is one I've mentioned before, failing to realize that plyometric training is actually technical training for sprinting, meaning that you're applying forces in horizontal and vertical planes, and you have to be accustomed to producing and applying forces in those planes. So that's probably the single biggest one. So therefore, if you have a nice steady dosage of short horizontal bounds, then you can kind of expect your acceleration capabilities to improve physically and technically because of the fact that the body is becoming better at pushing in a horizontal plane, and acceleration is a horizontally dominant activity. I've noticed that over time, as athletes become better and better at vertical plyometrics, typically their maximal velocity mechanics improve, and that often is, I think that can be accounted for by the fact that at maximal velocity, a lot of the pushing is genuinely vertical.
Yeah.
And I think that the ratios of vertical to horizontal work become very important. Humans, we're pretty much horizontally built creatures. We pretty much have the same hip, but as a horse or a dog, and they're on all fours, and we're standing up, so we're kind of built for horizontal much more than vertical. And so I've found personally that in order to get the movement quality I want for anybody, whether it's sprints, team sports, or whatever, I found that I typically have to work vertical to horizontal at a ratio of about 2 to 1.
Okay. Oh, that's interesting. Okay. And then how do your recommendations change, or do they change for team sports athletes?
They don't. Again, I'm looking at movement quality, and I'm looking at just the ability to move efficiently, the ability to apply forces to the ground effectively in multiple planes, and I'm looking for movement quality. So I don't think that they are different. The sports are different to some extent, but I think what I'm doing is I'm trying to build an organism, build a body that can function in any specific sport environment.
Mm.
So I really don't differentiate. I think that plyometrics and sprinting are human things. They're not sport-specific types of things, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Every once in a while, somebody will kind of hammer me on something like that, but I kind of stand by that statement. You know, like, for example, like if I'm working with a baseball player for speed, and I put him in a track stance for speed, and,
Mm-hmm.
you know, some coaches say, well, baseball players don't use that stance.
Mm-hmm.
I say, well, yeah, I understand that in baseball, but at the same time, right now, my concern is getting them to high velocities, not being sport specific, you know.
Mm.
And I think that that's one of the reasons why a lot of programs fail in speed and power development is simply because they try to be too specific as far as the sports are concerned.
Mm.
And often, when you try to be really sport specific, what happens is you become a little too technically complex, and as a result of that, the power output levels aren't what they ordinarily would be. And I'm trying to put people in position to maximize power output, to maximize velocities, to maximize acceleration rates,
Mm-hmm.
and that's what that's about. So I really think sometimes we do our athletes injustices, and they don't really progress as much as they could in speed, power, elastic strength development if we try to be overly specific in their training programs, particularly at younger ages.
Okay, so do you think it would be more beneficial? So, say like a soccer program, for example, right? I know a lot of them use like cone drills and things like that. Do you think it would be more beneficial to structure it more as like a plyometric and high output sprint? Of course, varying volumes and stuff depending on the day, versus some of those cone drills and things like that.
Well, obviously the cone drills are specific to soccer, so
Yeah.
they have a place.
Mm-hmm.
But the point I'm making is that when you're working with team sport athletes,
Mm-hmm.
at some point in time, if you want to make genuinely massive improvements in
Mm-hmm.
raw speed, raw power, raw elasticity,
Mm-hmm.
then you have to get away from the specific sport training.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
That's what I'm trying to say. You know, if you
Okay.
can't turn loose of that,
Yeah.
you know, that everything has to look like the sport, then you're not. You know, we often don't understand specificity. We
Yeah.
think in terms of specificity as the way something looks,
Mm.
but that isn't what specificity is all about. Specificity is important at the tissue level, and specificity is important at the biochemical level. That's
Mm-hmm.
where specificity is genuinely important.
Mm-hmm.
You
Yeah.
know, if you think for a second, you know, a lot of times things don't look mechanically like a sport, but they're very
Yeah.
specific. For example, at one time I was doing speed development with volleyball players.
Mm-hmm.
Volleyball players don't run very far.
Yeah.
Their court is like 30 by 30, you know, but what happens is when you do the speed development stuff with them, the neuromuscular development you get and the tension levels that are applied to the tissues are a huge improver of strength.
Mm.
And because of speed development stuff, then I saw these volleyball players' vertical jumps increase 2 to 3 inches
Oh, wow.
as a result of that cycle of speed development stuff.
Yeah.
And they didn't really care if they got faster.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is that if you look at what was happening in the muscle tissue and in the Achilles tendon at the cellular level, at the
Mhm.
tissue level, then that sprinting was actually very specific to what they do.
Mm.
You know, sprinters do depth jumps all the time. Well,
Yeah.
depth jumps don't look anything like a sprint test.
Yeah.
But we understand the impact and the tension levels are specific to sprinting. But why do on all these other sports we not give the same? Why do we not employ the same logic?
Mm.
So again, I'm always thinking in terms of specificity as far as not necessarily the appearance of a sport, but
Yeah.
specificity in terms of biochemical specificity,
Mm.
neuromuscular specificity,
Yeah.
neuromuscular integration levels, and so forth.
Mm. That makes a lot of sense. Okay. And then kind of, again, on the opposite side of that coin, or not necessarily opposite, but a complementing side, right? How does your weight room programming kind of reflect what you do on the track or on the field?
Well, I'm a firm believer in compatible training. I think that every day you send messages to your to the body at the cellular level as to what you want those adaptations can be, and what you want those adaptations to be. And if those messages are very clear, then you get massive amounts of adaptation. If
Mhm.
those messages send confusing messages, then you simply don't. So I have kind of rules that I follow, so to speak, whereas my strength training will always be compatible with my speed training. You know, if I am outside and I genuinely am doing my element stuff, plyometric types of stuff, and my weightlifting types of stuff is going to be pretty gross, Olympic lifts, squat moves, press moves, stuff like that. On the other hand, if what I'm doing is more fitness-based, if what I'm doing is possibly more endocrine-based, well then, strength training is going to be more circuit-based in that regard. So I try to follow those two basic groupings as religiously as I can.
Okay. And then you had, I had heard on a previous podcast that you had mentioned kind of getting into the lactate zone a little bit with Olympic lifts, right? Will you expand a little bit on this?
Yeah, well, coaches have known for a long time, researchers are finally kind of backing it up, that lactate does some positive things. If you take an athlete and subject them to moderate lactate levels, then there's some endocrine things that happen and growth hormone increases and such. So what I like to do is I spend a lot of time in the weight room with my Olympic lifting, doing sets of 4 or 5 and working in the 60-65% zone, like really fast bars, that type of stuff. And I know you can do, it's basic power stuff is what it is, and I know you can develop power with 2 or 3 reps, but by going 4 reps or 5 reps, what you do is you get just a little bit of lactate.
Yeah.
And the lactate you produce isn't significant enough to decrease the quality of the session or decrease the power output levels, but the lactate produces these hormonal responses. So now all of a sudden, now you're getting speed, now you're getting power development, and you're also building restoration into the same session. So you have all of that stuff wrapped up. That's why for us in our program, we'll do Olympic lifts pretty heavy at time to time, but 65% is kind of like our home base, and we continually return back to those sets of 4 at 65%-ish for that reason, because I think there's a lot of restoration stuff built into them.
Yeah, I like that. And then kind of pulling on that thread a little bit, and kind of something else that you said earlier about circuit-based, right, training. Will you talk a little bit about circuit-based training and some of the circuits like general fitness and even the recovery circuits that you have made, just in terms of like gross ideas?
Well, I do basically 3 types of circuits. Well, actually, I should say 4.
Okay.
The first type is in-place jump circuits, but those are kind of a walk hard. They're not restorative. They're genuine training. But when I look at the more fitness-based stuff and the more restorative stuff, they're basically 3. What I call general strength circuits, and those are body weight exercises. What I typically do is set them up, for, I'll take like maybe 12 to 16 different exercises, work rates or work times, or hover anywhere from 20 to 30 seconds, and normally a work to rest ratio of about 1 to 1, sometimes 2 to 1 or so. And what I'm doing with that type of circuit is I'm trying to do 2 things. I'm trying to achieve some fitness, but I'm also producing lactate levels. The deeper you get into endocrine science, the more we realize that fitness training and restoration training, the line between them is very, very blurry. And they're really more alike than we think. So a lot of the things that we typically think of as fitness are restorative in nature because of the lactate response that I mentioned earlier. So another type of work that I do for circuit-based stuff is medicine ball types of exercises. Not just the pitch and catch stuff, but also a lot of general calisthenic type of stuff using the medicine ball as a light load. And then there's weight training circuits that I do as well. Typically, working sets of 10, probably around 75% or so intensities on lots of different small muscle group types of exercises. Days of chaining those together so that we get about 20 to 24 total sets of work in. Those seem to have a really positive effect on growth hormone, serum growth hormone levels, probably serum testosterone levels, and also are probably very helpful as far as the body's ability to store more glycogen as well.
Okay.
General feeling, well-being. I know I've been coaching some athletes, for a long time, 6, 7 years. Typically, whenever they feel like garbage, normally they ask me for circuits because they know that's what makes them feel better. That's when they're doing them, maybe, but it makes them feel better after.
Yeah. No, I like that. Okay. And that makes a lot of sense too, because you're, like you said, you're causing a lot of change at the cellular level, whether or not like it might hurt at the time, but we're not necessarily looking at just one point in time. We're looking at the organism as a whole,
No, exactly. remember when I was a really young coach, all the coaching textbooks said, do your circuits in the early fall, and then in the late fall, you get away from your circuits. And I just always noticed there was a certain sharpness to my kids that just never was there again.
Yeah.
And then I just started continuing the circuits on deeper, and then I started realizing what they did. And, finally research is starting to back some of that stuff up. But good coaches have been doing it for a long time.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And then let's kind of talk. Go ahead. Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
I'll say the other advantage of the circuits is if you pick all these different exercises, then you have a very diverse array of movements. So you don't have any repetitive movement syndromes. That's why I'm not a big fan of running kids to get them fit. I'd rather circuit kids to get them fit.
Yeah.
Because in the circuits, if you have all these different exercises, the repetitive movements are minimized, and you don't have nearly as much injury risk as you do with other forms of fitness training.
And that's kind of was my next question, right? Like, what is your recommendation in kind of managing and preventing some injuries, such as like hamstring strains, or things like that, like a very common injury, or even like groins, things that occur often.
Yeah, well, I think that most injuries result from basically a couple of things. Number one, remember, we always have to keep in mind that the number one reason or cause of injury in any non-contact situation is always repetitive movement. So I think the number one thing right off the bat is to keep your training as diverse as you possibly can. If all you're doing is the same stuff over and over again without varying intensities, varying rest times, varying exercise choices, and so forth, well then it doesn't matter. Sooner or later you're going to break down. Another thing I think is the technical teaching associated with these skills. I just haven't seen many hamstring injuries in my lifetime that weren't associated with some type of technical flaw in the acceleration.
Okay.
So that's the other thing is sometimes we don't do a good job of technically teaching. Lots of times when I have athletes with lower leg stuff and shin splints and those types of things, if you look at the way they contact the ground during jumping exercises and during decelerations and things like that, then it becomes obvious. So sometimes, frankly, our worst enemy is us, and sometimes we just, I think, fall into the trap. I finally, after all these years, kind of conquered shin splints in my program, and I do it with 4 or 5 different techniques and different little things I do in my coaching. I found that there isn't one answer. That's why it's so hard to fix. But every 4th week, we deload on plyometrics, and it wouldn't matter if what I'm doing to prevent shin splints wouldn't matter if I didn't deload every 4th week. So I think that's another thing. Just the unwillingness to back off at certain times is a big one as well.
Yeah. Okay. And would you touch on some of those things that I know you've briefly touched on things throughout the podcast, but on some of the things that you do to conquer those shin splints?
Well, remember, your foot's not just a hammer, it's a shock absorber. So almost always when you look at a shin splint patient, you almost always find that the small bones of the foot are not gliding the way they should. So a lot of it takes physical manipulation of the foot to get those bones moving again so that the foot can again become pliable and move. So a lot of barefoot stuff in the sand, things that allow the individual toes to work independently of each other, getting them out of their shoes is a big help there. A lot of times massage is a big help. If you massage, the core that attaches in the shin and passes under the heel and under the foot, that's basically along the route along which the forces that produce shin splints they travel. So a lot of times massaging the length of that cord so that cord can slide and glide freely as opposed to sticking is another thing as well. Sometimes I use arch supports, even something as simple as like Dr. Scholl's stuff can be helpful.
Okay.
So all of these things can be a help. Natural anti-inflammants and so forth. So in short, it's a wide range of things.
Yeah.
A lot of times coach asks me, you can do one thing for shin splints. What would you do? Well, the answer is fail, because there is no one thing to approach the problem from many different angles.
Yeah.
But again, not to make light of it, have no sense for us in week 3, you might start to get just a little bit of those types of problems, but it's not a big deal because the next week is a down week.
Mm-hmm.
If I would just continue to pound through week 4, well, then I would be pretty miserable in my training camp.
Yeah. Okay. No, that makes complete sense, right? It's a systematic thing, and it's all encompassing, which most things involving the human organism should be, because again, everything is multifactorial that we do.
Exactly. If there was only one answer, we wouldn't have this problem.
Exactly. No, I like that. Okay. And then moving forward just a little bit, right, into some kind of leadership type, continuing education type stuff. You've been in kind of a more prominent role, like where you have people that you manage, right? So what is your approach in managing staff, or how does that kind of volunteer from like or how does that differ in volunteers to like assistants?
I think that as a leader, you have to provide opportunities to your staff to grow. And I think that what you do, I think a lot of that whole management piece is not just, I think in terms, not so much in terms of tasks, but in terms of roles.
Mm-hmm.
Helping people find ways that they can fit into an organization and fulfill duties and needs that aren't in the talent set of others in the organization. So much more about roles than tasks.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes, in some ways, in good organizations, I think to some extent, people start to build their own roles. You start to find out what people's strengths are, and next thing you know, they're doing things you didn't think they were going to be doing when they came into your organization.
Mm.
So I think that roles are an important thing, and I also think that as a leader who has more experience and has been at this a longer time, I think that supplying them with guidance and mentorship, I think, is very important as well.
Mm.
So I think that if it's only a boss-employee type of relationship, then we're losing a lot. But if it's more of a mentorship type of relationship, then I think it's far more valuable for that person.
Mm.
Unfortunately, a lot of times when you are in a leadership position, sometimes we're a little short with people, and sometimes we just don't have the time to offer professional development to them as much as we possibly could. But I think we need to strive to be a little better in that regard.
Mm.
And then finally, opportunity. You don't bring in help to keep them. You bring them to leave you. I use the example of a parent. You don't raise your children to stay with you all their lives. You raise them to fly away. And I think that you have to look at your staff the same way. Ideally, what we're trying to do is help these people to progress to a point where they're ready to fly and go on and accomplish bigger things. And if you're trying to hold on to them, we're probably doing them a disservice.
Yeah. No, I agree. Okay. And then what do you kind of look for when hiring for different positions, or what have you looked for in the past as well?
Well, the number one thing is lack of ego.
Mm.
That's a big one. Ego is the single biggest impediment to progress professionally.
Mm-hmm.
Without question. I always felt, that there are two human emotions which are the most devastating, and basically they are self-pity and rationalization. And rationalization and ego go hand in hand. Whenever there's a failure, instead of the ability to look at yourself and figure out where you went wrong, you rationalize it.
Mm.
So I try to look for people that are ego-free. I look for people that are very passionate, meaning that they literally love the training process, they love the sport, or whatever the case may be. And then finally, most important of all, is unselfishness. If they're selfish, then they'll never be any good either. They have to be unselfish, and at times you have to be willing to put others in place of yourself.
Mm-hmm.
There's an old joke, I heard it one time, and it says, and the word was, what's the difference between a personal trainer and a coach? And the joke was, well, a personal trainer is a fit person who trains unfit people. A coach is an unfit person who trains fit people. And I stopped and thought about it, and I said, you know what, that's pretty true in some ways, because the coach is not going to worry about getting their workout in. They're going to get their workout in only if they can do it after everybody else they're supposed to be training has had their workout.
Yeah.
Or the coach is going to grab a quick junk food meal because that coach has to handle athletes or work with athletes and doesn't have the time to, fix the nice, pretty, health food kind of dinner in a Tupperware container every day, So I just think that I look for people that are willing to kind of sacrifice and people who are really all about the clients as opposed to people who are really about themselves.
Yeah.
If you're a person who comes to the gym and it's all about, your supplements and your food and you're getting your workout in at some point in time, well, I'm just not that interested in that.
I like that. Okay. So transitioning into some more professional development specifically for young coaches, do you have any general format tips for like resumes?
I don't, first of all, I don't consider this to be my expertise, but I generally speaking, I look for a couple of things. First of all, I think that the cover letter should be concise. I think that one of the most common things is that hirers lose interest in a client, in a potential hire, when the cover letter is too wordy, meaning a lot of the stuff that's in cover letters ought to be in the resume, so to speak. And so I think the cover letter should be really quick, really concise. Just state who you are, what you're after, and maybe point to a couple of key points in your resume, and then that's it. And then the resume is, I think, what should be really complete for the most part and should really talk for you. I do think, though, that people need to be honest about their resumes. A lot of times you do something in a particular position and you listen, and sometimes we have a little bit of we exaggerate a little bit. It really wasn't a big deal. We try to make it sound like it was a big deal. Well, I think that when people do hiring and trying to fill positions, I think those things stand out like a sore thumb. And they also kind of cast doubt, I think, on the more solid parts of the resume as well. So I think being honest in the resume, if you're just not that very experienced, well, that's not going to kill you if all you're looking for is an entry-level position at that point in your time.
Yeah.
At that point in your life, So ultimately, your passion is what's going to get you that job, So I just think you have to be honest about it. And I think it should be complete, too. I think we're all a sum of all of our experiences. So I don't think it matters if you're 55 years old and you have some internship that you did when you were 22 years old and it's on your resume. I really don't think there's anything wrong with that because who knows, the person you did that that internship with that you put on that resume might have a relationship with that person or might have a mentoring relationship with a potential hirer or whatever. So I don't think that you ever have to really curtail your resume per se.
I like that. Okay. And then moving forward into some questions from some other coaches, right? What are some good resources for young coaches to read and learn more about speed development?
I always tell them, go find a coach that you think is doing good work and go find them. Watch them.
Yeah.
Out there. I'll be very honest with you. I get asked all the time, what are the best speed books? And I know there are some, but the bottom line is the good coaches don't write their coaching. The good coaches don't take the time to write books. They're out there with athletes every day and typically don't have the time to do that. So I always look in terms of mentorship. I go back to when I was a young coach and I, found people that I thought were really good and I made it a point to get out there to watch them coach where I could talk to them, watch what they did and so forth. So I just think mentorship is by far the most valuable thing, the most valuable resource that you have.
Okay. And then another question was, what are your thoughts on wicket drills in training?
You ask that because it's me. I'm notorious for not doing wickets. I think that wicket drills, and don't get me wrong, there are some coaches who do them and do them well, but I do think that they've become kind of a panacea, and there are many, many coaches who are allowing the wickets to do the coaching for them, and I think that's a very bad thing. And the reason why is because wickets are very, very easy to do incorrectly.
Okay.
Sprinting is about applying forces to the ground.
Yeah.
And if sprinting is about applying forces to the ground, the last thing I want to do is build a teaching system around the lifting component as opposed to the downward strength. And if with wickets, that's what you're really looking at is you're looking at the lifting component of sprinting. So,
Mm-hmm.
so I personally avoid them like the plague, but I will be the first to admit that there are a couple of sprint coaches who use them and do a very, very good job with them.
Okay. So if someone was, or say some of these coaches that do a very good job, what's kind of the difference that they do on them versus other coaches?
I think they understand the mechanics. They understand the idea of hip projection over the wicket as opposed to simply picking up the feet to produce front side.
Okay. No, that's a good answer. Okay, I love it.
They're able to put wickets. Yeah, they're able to coach wickets with an emphasis on the down strike as opposed to wickets with an emphasis on the upward.
Yeah. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And then moving into this very last segment here, if you have any, what are some quotes that you live by?
Oh, quotes that I live by. That's good. Well, timeless truth doesn't sell. That's a fact. Meaning, fancy things seem to be commercially successful, but timeless truth is just not a very successful commercial model, but it'll win you lots and lots of trophies and lots of competitions. So, bells and whistles are often the problem in our sport, in our coaching. Bright shiny things are very commercially successful quite often, and in many cases, though they serve as a distraction and they distract coaches from ultimately achieving what they want to achieve simply because they take detours which aren't necessarily the best, I guess. I guess that would be one. Timeless truth doesn't sell. I think I read that one time in a Calvin and Hobbes cartoon or something like that.
Okay.
And so I think another one also, maybe ignorance is God's gift to the stupid. Meaning that, some people, when they don't understand something, they just tend to discount it completely and kind of deny its existence. So they can remain in their own little world and remain comfortable and project themselves forward as an expert when in fact they're not. So I just hope that for the remainder of my life I find lots and lots of things that confuse me just to keep me humble and to help me understand that I haven't figured it all out yet.
Okay. No, I like that. Awesome. Is there a thought? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say the best gifts a coach has are their problems, because that's what ultimately coaching is, about problem solving. No problems in coaching, then you don't progress. And if you have problems and you use rationalization in order to account for those problems, well, then you're just not going to get very far.
I like that. That's a good outlook. I think more people need to have that outlook as well.
Well, the reason I'm bald is because I always criticize myself. I'm always self-critical.
I like it. Okay. Is there a thought or experience?
All that hair fell out for that reason,
Yeah. No, I like it. Okay. Is there a thought or experience from your past that you've held on to that has made a big difference in your life now?
One single one is hard to say. I don't think so, but I do think that my coaching career turned around when I developed the confidence to trust my instincts. I was a person who kind of discounted my own thoughts at times. In other words, other people were looking at it one way and I was looking at it differently. And I figured, well, they've been at it longer, they must know more. And I just kind of thought I was wrong because I didn't see it the way they did. And I was just really lucky in in certain points in my career that I had some good mentors who kind of grabbed me and said, no, you're seeing it right. You need to trust yourself. And I think that's the single biggest thing. If I could go back, 40 years when I started coaching and tell myself something, I think that's what I would say. I would just say, just trust your instincts.
I love it. Okay. What is the best advice you've ever been given?
Best advice I've ever been given? I think that was it.
Probably trust your instincts.
The idea of trusting yourself.
Yeah. Okay.
I remember when Coach Path was kind of my mentor when I was real young, and I'd come to him and I'd say, this is what I'm seeing, and he'd say, oh, I see it the same way. So why isn't anybody else saying it?
Yeah.
Because they're not special, and he gave me that confidence.
Yeah.
And that was helpful.
Okay. So in contrast to that, what's the worst advice you've ever been given?
I don't know if I've ever been given bad advice, but there's some, what's the word I'm looking for? There's some value in almost anything you hear, even if it's something not to do.
Yeah.
But I think that the worst advice that I've ever been given always falls into the same category, simplistic deductions, meaning that you look at something and on the surface it appears to be something, and therefore we kind of just fall into the easy way rather than digging into it more deeply in a more sophisticated manner to truly evaluate what's going on. I try never to take anything at face value. If it looks super easy and it looks super obvious, then chances are there's a level of deepness, there's a level of sophistication involved that we're not getting.
Okay. And then kind of last question here on this, what are some projects that you're currently working on, and how can people kind of reach out to you and follow your journey?
Okay, well, I always got my lab going. My personal coaching is my lab, so to speak, so I always got that. So yeah. I'm always conducting research and that type of stuff with the athletes I work with and everything. So that's what I got going. I also have a project going right now, putting together a DVD on weight training periodization for speed power sports. Some of my views on weight training periodization are a little different than a lot of people's, and a lot of people find that systems work well, so I'm trying to put it together into a publication that people can have, and I have a website, SACSpeed, SACSpeed.com, if anybody's ever interested in what I'm doing. I'm not a very good technology person, but I do have a website, and if people are interested in what I'm doing or what materials I have available, they're welcome to visit there or email me through that site.
Okay. Awesome. Well, Coach, thank you so much for your time. This has been fantastic. I've learned a ton. It was great getting to connect with you, and hopefully we can connect again soon in the future.